first wave of the British invasion had thrown the North American music scene on its ear, but there were a small handful of artists that would survive and even thrive in its aftermath. Buffalo-Springfield was one of those bands. Not only would they thrive, but along the way they would provide a divided and torn America with its most signature song of those times. Stills was a true force of nature. He was from the South, but he had recently transplanted from Greenwich Village, New York, to come out here to California and make his mark. So this small apartment here on Fountain used to be owned by Dickie Davis, who was stage manager at the Troubadour at the time. It's now owned by Horatio right here. And this is where Stephen lived with Dickie Davis. He befriended him, and it's where he tried to put together his band. He was having no luck here in LA, so he called one of the few people in New York that he thought would fit the bill and told him he had a band ready to go. And of course, that was Richie Furay. And when Richie got out here, he of course saw what a salesman Stephen was. And he joined the roommate procession and slept on Dickie Davis's floor here too. But anyways, Dickie Davis arms, now the Horatio arms right here on Fountain. All right, take it easy, bud. We're gonna go right up the street right now. So over the course of the next few weeks, they weren't able to find anybody to join their band, but it did give them the time to get together some material, including a song by a songwriter they had both met back east called Nowadays Clancy Can't Even Sing, and it was by Neil Young. And the material was good enough to catch the ear of a local music impresario named Barry Friedman. And Barry Friedman lived in what is now this parking lot at Plummer Park. And there was like 4 different houses right here, but it wasn't long before Stephen and Richie found themselves living here too. And by the way, this is the spot where the guys later on saw the big steamroller, the Buffalo-Springfield steamroller, sitting out on the street, and that's of course how they got their name. But no matter how hard Stephen and Richie tried, they couldn't seem to find like-minded musicians. The ironic thing was they had both met the perfect bandmate back east a few months previous, and it would take one of the most eerily karmic events in the history of rock and roll to finally bring them together. Back in 1965, most transient musicians didn't have a stable address, let alone a phone number, and trying to track one down with long-distance phone calls was expensive as well as nearly impossible. But thus was the saga of Neil Young and Stephen Stills. Previously, they had cut their teeth touring and found themselves sharing a bill in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is north of Lake Superior. And they both shared the idea of fusing folk music with rock and roll. And they were quite surprised to find a kindred spirit in such a godforsaken place as Thunder Bay. But the mutual impression that they made on each other was so strong that they basically spent the next year looking for each other from East Coast to West Coast. So Neil guessed that Stephen was out here on the West Coast trying to get something together. And he had driven cross-country with bassist Bruce Palmer to search for him. And they had spent a week here looking in nightclubs and coffee bars, things like that, and just had no luck at all. So totally frustrated, they decided to take Neil's old hearse and go up to San Francisco and see if they could make anything happen up there. And they were driving along Sunset Boulevard here towards the freeway, and in the opposite direction, Stephen, Richie, and Barry Friedman were driving in a van, and somebody saw a hearse with Ontario plates, and they did a U-turn in rush hour traffic right here. They stopped them, and they basically, it was bedlam right in the middle of rush hour traffic on Sunset Boulevard here, and it was a 1 in a million moment, and they held it. So the band quickly found the last piece of the puzzle in drummer Dewey Martin, who was a fellow Canadian like Neil Young and Bruce Palmer, oh Canada. But anyways, we're in the gritty heart of Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard, and this is where Barry Friedman had rented the band a couple rooms here, at the former Hollywood Center Motel. And as you can see, this place puts the D in dump. And unlike fine wine, I don't think aging's gonna make it get any better. Neil and Steven had one room, and Bruce, Dewey, and Richie had the other. And it's rumored that Barry Friedman gave them $1 a day to live on. And at the time, they were so broke that they were living on uncooked hot dogs. But anyways, there's a good view of this out back, so let's take a little stroll. So one of the main reasons they stayed here was the complex was very close to an old rundown theater, which has since burnt down, but they could rehearse there full on with electric guitars and drums. And in about a week's time, they were good enough to start doing gigs. And they actually played on a short 6-city tour, opening up for the Byrds. So unlike the Byrds, the Buffalo-Springfield's repertoire was virtually all original music. And they had not one, not two, but 3 pretty strong songwriters in the group, as well as lead singers, although you know, Neil Young didn't come to the fore with his vocals till a little bit later. They all came from a folk background, which meant there was a lot of minor chords and unconventional chord changes. But with Dewey Martin and Bruce Palmer holding down the rhythm, they brought a very R&B, rock and roll thing to it, and they knew how to make people get up and dance. And there was no denying that when Neil Young and Stephen Stills were playing lead guitar up there and trading riffs, there was no one else doing anything like this in all of LA. Anyways, right here. So here we are at the legendary Whiskey A Go-Go, and with the help of one of their early advocates and one of the really truly good guys in rock and roll, Chris Oman of the Byrds, they were able to score a gig here at the Whiskey, and in with 6 weeks had really taken up residency here.
Buffalo-Springfield was about to become the next it band, and they knew it. New alliances were formed, a new management team moved in, and friend and benefactor Barry Friedman was pushed aside. Things were changing, and not all for the best.
And I think these times were the innocent times before the drugs and entourages and egos all kicked in, that the band would look on as the best and most exciting of their career. Anyways, Whiskey A Go-Go.
In the summer of 1966, just months after the very first gig, Buffalo-Springfield had gotten signed by Atco Records and started recording here at what used to be Gold Star Studios. Perhaps the most legendary recording studio of the 60s, this is where Phil Spector cut his Wall of Sound recordings and where the Beach Boys did much of Good Vibrations. But as you can see, it's been torn down to make way for something with much more character, a strip mall and a Starbucks, which is how we like to preserve our history here in Southern California. The album pretty much stiffed when it came out. Sonically, it was a disappointment to the band. It had been virtually their first time in a recording studio, and instead of using a veteran producer, they had used their managers. Hey, it worked for the Rolling Stones and Andrew Loog Oldham, right? So why not? But in Springfield's case, it had been rather like the blind leading the blind. What did work out well for them here was they met an engineer named Stan Ross, who would be instrumental a couple months later when they went down the street to Columbia Studios to cut For What It's Worth. Interestingly, the first pressing of the Buffalo-Springfield album was released in early December of 1966, the very same day the band was at Columbia laying down the tracks For What It's Worth, which would be rushed for release as a single just days later. After it hit, it was hastily included on the second pressing of the album in early 1967, and if you have an original pressing of the record with no For What It's Worth on it, you got yourself a real live collector's item.
So with 3 guitarists, I think Buffalo-Springfield is what you would call a guitar band. And although Neil Young was the de facto lead guitarist in the band, Stephen Stills was no slouch either. And they were legendary for having guitar jams on stage. And I don't think anyone else in LA was really doing it at the time. And I don't think anyone else in America really got into doing that until Leonard Skinner did in the 70s down south. And we know what respect they had for Neil Young with their song Sweet Home Alabama. But anyways, in the Springfield days, Neil Young was playing a Gretsch Chet Atkins, much like this one. His was orange in a single cutaway. He also played a Gretsch White Falcon, a 58 also, which he later traded to Stephen Stills. And Stephen Stills actually still has and plays the guitar today. Stephen was also into Gretsch guitars because if you took the pick guard off, it was easier to finger pick them, and that was what he was known for at the time. He also had a Les Paul Black Beauty. Unfortunately, the guitar was stolen during his Springfield days. I don't know if he ever got it back. Richie Furay used to like playing a Telecaster like this. He also had a 335 12-string, and the 335 looks like the guitar Chuck Berry played. But I don't think I can leave here without talking about Neil Young's main guitar that he came upon while he was in Springfield, and it's called Old Black. And it was a Les Paul like this one with a Bigsby on it. It was a gold top. I believe it was in 1954. When he got it, it had already been oversprayed black, and he left it that way. But the story on that is he met the Springfield's future bassist, Jim Messina, at the Troubadour, and he traded Jim Messina his Gretsch single cutaway for Old Black. And he's had it ever since, and it's appeared on virtually every album Neil Young's ever made. And I think possibly the only guitar that might be as famous in the world is Willie Nelson's Trigger. But all right, on to our next spot. But it's gonna be hard leaving here. So, all right, let's move on. So the epicenter of the LA music scene at the time was Laurel Canyon, and there are a couple places that were central to the Buffalo-Springfield story in Laurel Canyon, and we're about a block or two up from the country store. And this place right here used to be Richie Furay's house, where he lived with his new wife Nancy at the time. And by the way, they're still married. You know, between the yin and the yang of Stephen and Neil and the revolving door of bass players and musical differences, I think that Richie was pretty unwavering in his commitment to the band, and that I think that speaks to his character, not only as a band member, but as a person, and it still does, right here. Anyways, we're gonna go check out Neil Young's place on Utica in Laurel Canyon here. We've kind of got a cool view of it, so let's go check it out. On the left or right?
Right there, with the white windows, right there.
That's the house right there.
That's the house.
All right, so now we're up at the top of Utica, Neil Young's place down there.
Yes.
And why don't you point out for us where it is?
It's right over there, the one with the white windows.
The one with the white windows.
And it has a little bit of a balcony, a deck with a chair on it.
And Utica's right underneath us, so there's like tons and tons of steps up there, right?
Yeah.
Correct? By the way, this is Randy, my good Laurel Canyon friend who knows where everything is here. So, but that's where his shack was.
Yeah.
And that's where he wrote many of his first early Buffalo-Springfield songs. According to him, he always used a felt tip pen, and he wrote it on old newspapers because to get paper it was too much of a hassle to go. Also, he had to get rid of his beloved Pontiac hearse because it wouldn't make it up these steep canyon hills. And I think he ended up getting a Corvette or something, so probably a little more popular with the ladies that way. Again, this is Utica Drive, and it's the Neil Young house. All right. Downtown. So now we're coming to the base of Laurel Canyon, right where it intersects with Crescent Heights and Sunset Boulevard. And this is the former site of the nightclub Pandora's Box. And in November of 1966, this was the epicenter of the Sunset Strip curfew riots that occurred. And it's also where Buffalo-Springfield's most enduring song, For What It's Worth, was born, right here. So there's several versions about what transpired when Stephen wrote the song. And to quote one of my favorite movies, when legend becomes a fact, print the legend. So here goes. According to Stephen, who by this time was living in Topanga Canyon, he came to Hollywood to go clubbing. He drove over Laurel Canyon here and ran smack dab into 2,000 kids protesting the 10 p.m. curfews. The epicenter of it was right here at Pandora's Box. They were holding a mock funeral for the club. And the LAPD was waiting for them here in tactical gear, and I don't think you have to have much of an imagination to figure out what happened next. But this totally freaked Stephen out. He had been trying to connect an idea between the kids here in the States and the guys serving in Vietnam, and this whole thing sparked it for him. As soon as he got his hands on a guitar, he had the song written in 15 minutes. And I think it's one of those songs that captures the what the fuck is going on here attitude better than any other song of its time. And I think it's a song that's going to endure long after we're all gone. Anyways, for what it's worth, right here. .24058 Malibu Road here was formerly owned by Vincent Price, but technically it was Stephen Still's place in the magical summer of 1967. Pretty much all the members of the band were living here. It was rather like the Monkees beach pad come to life. And this is where they worked up many of the songs for their second album again, which is a great album. It's got Bluebird on it, Rock and Roll Woman, Broken Arrow, and many more. But anyways, we're going to go around front and take a look. So here we are at the front of the house right here. And in 1967, this is where Buffalo-Springfield was rehearsing. They had their instruments set up in the living room. And besides being one of the biggest party houses in Malibu, they had a lot of jams here. Jimi Hendrix was a visitor. He came a lot. He and Stephen really struck up a great friendship. Buddy Miles came here. This is where David Crosby started hanging around with the band in earnest. I think that Stephen was pretty much the undisputed leader of the Buffalo-Springfield, but I think it was Neil Young that really brought something that nobody else had to a group. And he made them different from everybody else. At first, Richie and Stephen were the lead singers of the group, and nobody really wanted Neil to sing lead. He had a thinner, winsome voice. And either by will or sheer number of songs he was writing, he wanted to make himself heard. And I have to say, I can't think of anybody else singing lead vocal on a song like Mr. Soul than Mr. Neil Young. Right here. About 20 miles northwest of Hollywood is Topanga Canyon, and back in the day it was quite the bustling little place. Graham Parsons had a place here. Linda Ronstadt lived here. It was home base for the band Canned Heat. And Topanga is, of course, where the legendary Buffalo-Springfield drug bust took place on March 20, 1968. There's several differing accounts about where it happened at, but most people seem to think it happened here at Stephen's former girlfriend, Susan Hafley's house. So Stephen was hanging here, jamming with Springfield, and he had a very special visitor. It was Eric Clapton from Cream. And these guys like to play really loud. And the jam kind of turned into a party, and either somebody called the cops, one of the neighbors, or some people say it was a setup. But soon enough, they were surrounded by cops and busted. Only Dewey Martin and Stephen Stills, who crept out the back, were able to escape. Everyone else was brought down busted. They made him strip. They sprayed him with water and doused them. Eric Clapton, who had the longest hair, was made to stand naked in front of all the others, wearing only his pink boots. And then he was thrown in a tank with three rather unsavory characters. And only his knowledge of American music and blues created some common ground so that these guys didn't really F him up. So for all intents and purposes, this was the last nail in the Buffalo-Springfield coffin. Bruce Palmer was gone for good. Neil Young told him he was leaving for the third time. He told him he'd play out their final dates, which, by the way, occurred at Long Beach Arena on May 5th, 1968, not long after this. Anyways, Bust House. So after barely only 2 years, the Buffalo-Springfield had ended almost as quickly as they started. Richie Furay went off to form Poco and spearhead California country rock. Stephen Stills, of course, formed Crosby, Stills & Nash, and later he added Neil Young. Neil did some chart topping himself as a solo artist and is still regarded as one of the finest songwriters, not to mention one of the most innovative guitarists of all time. This happens to be the house right here that he came up with Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere and After the Gold Rush. And as far as After the Gold Rush goes, he recorded it right here in this room. We did a video a couple months ago and visited, so if you'd like to see it, details below. Anyways, nearly 60 years later, and Neil, Stephen, and Richie are still playing and going strong. And personally, what I came away with in making this video was how incredibly important Buffalo-Springfield were to the very foundations of rock and roll. So for Tim, I'd like to thank you for hanging out with us right here. If you haven't done it already, I'd appreciate your subscription. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. Keep playing it, keep playing it. Bye-bye.